By July of 1876, $1 million in gold, at $20 an ounce, had already been pulled from the creeks around a town that didn't legally exist. Deadwood sat on Lakota Sioux land, guaranteed to them by the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868. There was no government, no sheriff, no court with jurisdiction. The nearest railroad was over 200 miles away in Sidney, Nebraska. And yet, crammed into a narrow gulch choked with the stumps of dead trees, somewhere between 5,000 and 25,000 people, the estimates vary wildly, were building a city as fast as pine boards could be nailed together. They had 173 businesses running before the year was out. Monthly rent on a crude two-room log cabin ran $25 to $40. The place had 3 sawmills before it had a single lawman. The name came from the trees. A gulch full of dead timber, standing gray and barkless on the hillsides above 2 creeks, Whitewood and Deadwood, that met in a narrow Y at the canyon floor. In the fall of 1875, a small party of prospectors found gold in that creek bed, and by the following spring, 7 separate mining camps had sprung up along the gulch: Montana City, Fountain City, Elizabethtown, Deadwood City, South Deadwood, Ingleside, and Cleveland. They would eventually merge into a single settlement that sprawled along the creek bottom, hemmed in on both sides by steep, forested hillsides that left almost no room to grow. The town's main street was just a trail that had been hacked through the brush, wide enough in some places to look respectable, barely wide enough in others for a single wagon. And on that improbable strip of mud, one of the most extraordinary communities in American history assembled itself in a matter of months. The people who built Deadwood weren't just drifters. They were, many of them, experienced operators who had followed gold from California to Nevada to Montana and knew exactly what a boomtown needed. By July of that first summer, miners had pulled $4 million worth of gold from Deadwood Gulch, a figure that attracted not just prospectors, but also the full ecosystem of frontier commerce: merchants, lawyers, teamsters, prostitutes, cooks, blacksmiths, doctors, and at least one printer. A W. Merrick hauled a printing press from Denver, originally headed for Custer, but he followed the miners north when the northern diggings proved richer. On June 8, 1876, the Black Hills Pioneer published its first issue. Deadwood had a newspaper before it had a jail. That same summer, Jack Langrish, an Irish-born actor and impresario who'd been running theaters across the frontier for 17 years, arrived with his wife Jeanette and his entire acting company. They opened Deadwood's first legitimate theater in July 1876 and began performing the latest Broadway hits, plays that were running simultaneously in New York and London, to audiences of miners who paid admission in gold dust. Within a week of the theater's opening, Wild Bill Hickok was murdered in a saloon next door, and the Langrish Theater was immediately requisitioned for the murder trial. That trial tells you nearly everything about what Deadwood was. On August 2, 1876, James Butler Hickok, already a national celebrity, his gunfighting exploits exaggerated by dime novels and Harper's Magazine, was playing poker at Nuttall and Mann's Saloon No. 10. He usually sat with his back to the wall. On this particular afternoon, the only open chair faced away from the door, and another player, Charles Rich, refused to switch seats. Hickok sat down anyway. A drifter named Jack McCall, who had lost badly to Hickok the night before and been offered money for breakfast, a kindness he apparently took as an insult, walked up behind him, put a .45 caliber revolver to the back of his head, shouted something, and fired. Hickok died holding 2 pair, aces, and 8s. Poker players still call it the dead man's hand. The next day, the camp assembled a miners' court in the Langrish Theater. They appointed a judge, a prosecutor, a defense attorney, and a jury. The trial lasted 2 hours. McCall claimed he'd been avenging a brother. He was acquitted and told to leave town. There was no legal basis for any of it. No incorporated town, no territorial authority, no recognized jurisdiction. McCall fled to Wyoming, where he made the fatal mistake of bragging about what he'd done. Federal authorities declared the Deadwood trial illegitimate, rearrested him, tried him in Yankton, the capital of Dakota Territory, and hanged him on March 1, 1877. When they moved the cemetery years later and dug up McCall's body, the noose was still around his neck. But But the episode had consequences beyond McCall's fate. The federal court's assertion of jurisdiction over the Black Hills was, in effect, the moment the law arrived, and Deadwood, reluctantly, began the long process of becoming a real city. Seth Bullock had actually arrived the day before Hickok was killed, though the two never met. Bullock was a Canadian-born former sheriff from Montana who'd come to Deadwood not to enforce the law, but to sell hardware. He and his partner, Saul Starr, a Bavarian-born Jewish immigrant, rolled into the gulch with an ox-drawn wagon piled with mining equipment, Dutch ovens, frying pans, and chamber pots. Their first night in town, Bullock auctioned supplies to the highest bidder. Within a year, they'd built a proper store and warehouse at the corner of Main and Wall Streets, a piece of real estate that would prove to be one of the most consequential addresses in Deadwood's history. But the camp's appetite for order after the Hickok fiasco led to Bullock's appointment as sheriff a few months later. He was, by all accounts, physically imposing. Tall, broad-shouldered, with steel-gray eyes that contemporaries said could stare down a cobra. He managed to tame the wildest town in the West, reportedly, without killing anyone. Keep that address in mind. We'll come back to it. By 1877, the other major figure had arrived, George Hearst, not the newspaper tycoon. That was his son, William Randolph. George was a Missouri farm boy turned mining magnate who had a legendary ability to read rock. He'd already made fortunes at the Comstock Lode in Nevada and the Ontario Silver Mine in Utah. When brothers Fred and Moses Manuel struck gold in a quartz outcropping near the neighboring camp of Lead in April 1876, Hearst sent a trusted scout named Ludwig Kellogg to investigate. Kellogg secured a purchase option and reported back that the mine would produce enough gold for his grandchildren's grandchildren. Considering that the Homestake Mine would operate continuously for 126 years, he was right. Hearst and his partners, Lloyd Tevis and James Ben Alley Hagan, bought the Manuel brothers' claim for $70,000. Then Hearst did what he always did. He started buying everything around it. Claim after claim, paying as much as $100,000 when he had to, taking others to court when he could. He purchased Deadwood newspapers to shape public opinion. An opposing editor was attacked on the street. The consolidation was ruthless, but it was also visionary. Within 2 years, Hearst had assembled 30 acres of ore-bearing land, invested $200,000 in development, and built an 80-stamp mill that began crushing ore in July 1878. In 1879, he listed Homestake Mining Company on the New York Stock Exchange, reportedly the first publicly traded mining stock in America. Then he walked out of the Black Hills alive, which was not a foregone conclusion, and moved on to copper in Montana. The mine he left behind would eventually produce over 40 million troy ounces of gold. At today's prices, that's somewhere north of $70 billion. The Homestake transformed everything. Deadwood had begun as a placer mining camp, men with pans and shovels working the creek beds. But the easy gold was surface gold, and it ran out fast. What the Homestake revealed was that the real wealth lay underground, locked in massive deposits of low-grade ore that required industrial-scale extraction. Individual prospectors couldn't do that work. Corporations could. And so the economy of the Black Hills shifted almost overnight, from freelance prospecting to wage labor. By the mid-1880s, the Homestake employed over 2,000 men. The population of Lead, the company town that grew up around the mine, surpassed Deadwood's by 1885. But Deadwood remained the commercial and entertainment capital of the region, the place where miners spent their pay. And then, on September 26, 1879, at about 2:30 in the morning, a baker at the Empire Bakery on Sherman Street knocked over a coal oil lamp. The fire moved through Deadwood's pine-board buildings like it was chasing something. Every structure in town was built from sap-filled Black Hills timber, and the entire place was a tinderbox. When the flames reached Jensen and Bliss Hardware, they found 8 kegs of black gunpowder in the back room. The explosion sent burning planks sailing across the gulch, igniting rooftops on the far side of town. Deadwood had organized a volunteer fire company, but they had no water system, just the creek. Over 300 buildings burned. 2,000 people were left homeless. A deaf man named John King, sleeping in Stone's hotel, was the only fatality. The damage ran to approximately $1.6 million, a staggering sum for a 3-year-old town. What happened next is the pivot of this story. Many people left and never came back. The 1880 census counted 3,777 residents, down significantly from the peak. But the people who stayed, and this is the key, didn't just rebuild. They rebuilt in brick and stone. They rebuilt, as one historian put it, with an image of permanence. The rubble was barely cool before construction crews were at work, and within 6 months, a new Deadwood had risen from the ashes. Victorian commercial buildings with Italianate facades, sandstone foundations, decorative cornices in the colonial revival, and Queen Anne and East Lake styles. The architecture you see on Main Street today, what makes Deadwood a National Historic Landmark, is essentially the architecture of 1880. The fire that nearly killed the town created the town that would endure. Al Swearingen rebuilt too. He'd opened his Gem Variety Theater on Lower Main Street in April 1877, and it had become the most profitable and most notorious establishment in the Gulch. The contrast with Langrishe's theater, just up the street, was stark and deliberate. Langrishe offered Shakespeare and comedies and the latest New York productions. Swearingen offered prize fights staged in a 5-by-5-foot ring. Comedians, singers, dancers, and primarily prostitutes. The Gem took in an estimated $5,000 on an average night, sometimes $10,000, the equivalent of well over $100,000 in today's money. It was technically a saloon and theater. In practice, it was a brothel, and a brutal one. Swearingen recruited women from the East by advertising legitimate jobs, advanced them money for the one-way trip, and then, when they arrived, forced them into prostitution through threats, beatings, and what amounted to indentured servitude. Customers routinely assaulted the women. Gunfights between drunken patrons were common enough to be unremarkable. The Black Hills Daily Pioneer, in one of those moments of Victorian understatement, initially described the Gem as neat and tastefully arranged as any place of its kind in the West. The fire of 1879 destroyed it. Swearingen rebuilt it bigger. The fire of 1894 destroyed it again. He rebuilt it again. In 1899, it burned a third time, and this time he was done. He left town, married again in Iowa, and eventually died in 1904 after being found beaten in a Denver rail yard. When the Gem burned for the last time, one newspaper wrote that harrowing tales of wretchedness and ruined lives had been told of the place, and that they were not all groundless. The Gem site on Lower Main Street, what was known as the Badlands, is today a parking lot next to the Celebrity Hotel. But in the 1880s and 1890s, as the Gem and its imitators held court at one end of Main Street, the other end was transforming into something the early prospectors would not have recognized. Deadwood was becoming civilized, and the proof was in the buildings. The first electric lights flickered on in December 1883, less than 4 years after Edison demonstrated the incandescent bulb. Telephone lines went up in 1878, just 1 year after President Hayes got phone service at the White House. A telegraph line had connected Deadwood to Cheyenne as early as December 1876. This was not a backwater waiting for the modern world to arrive. This was a town racing to join it. The Chinatown that developed on Lower Main Street in those years was, by some accounts, the largest Chinese community of any city east of San Francisco. By 1880, the census listed 221 Chinese residents in Deadwood, 202 men and 19 women. They ran laundries that brought in $10 a day, restaurants serving both Chinese dishes and apple pie, groceries, boarding houses. Phi Li Wang, who arrived in 1876 as a cook and went by the name Wing Tzu, sold 2 gold claims for $75,000 and used the proceeds to open the Wing Tzu Emporium at 566 Main Street, importing silk, porcelain, herbs, and tea. He built a solid brick building in 1885, added a second in 1896. His children attended Deadwood's public schools. He organized Chinese hose cart teams that competed in the town's 4th of July fire races. He invited his non-Chinese neighbors to celebrate Chinese New Year. But the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 slowly strangled the community. By 1900, only 73 Chinese residents remained. By 1931, when a janitor named Ching Ong locals called him Teeter, packed his belongings and left after 45 years in the Black Hills, Deadwood's Chinatown existed only in memory. When construction crews broke ground for a parking garage in the 2000s, they found remnants of the old Chinatown district buried beneath the pavement. Before the railroad came, everything that entered or left Deadwood, every pound of machinery, every case of whiskey, every passenger, every ounce of gold, traveled by stagecoach or ox-drawn freight wagon. The Cheyenne and Black Hills stage, established in 1876, ran a route of roughly 300 miles from the Union Pacific Railhead in Cheyenne, Wyoming, through country that was still genuinely dangerous. Shotgun messengers, men selected specifically because they had reputations as killers, rode alongside the treasure coaches that carried gold out of the hills. Boone May, Gale Hill, Scott Davis, Jesse Brown. Their names don't echo like Hickok's, but they kept the gold moving. The stagecoach company fitted special coaches for the purpose, and bandits responded with ambushes at relay stations along the route. The most famous Deadwood stage, a Concord coach built in New Hampshire in 1863, eventually ended up in Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, where it circled arenas in London and Paris as a prop illustrating frontier drama it had actually lived through. The isolation shaped everything about early Deadwood, including its theater. Jack Langrish's company couldn't rotate in new troops the way Eastern theaters did because no railroad meant no easy travel. So Langrish's actors performed as many as 5 different plays in a single week, cycling through their repertoire to keep the audiences coming back. When the Fremont, Elkhorn, and Missouri Valley Railroad finally pulled into Deadwood on December 28, 1890, it didn't just bring building materials and manufactured goods. It ended a cultural isolation that had defined the town's first 14 years. Suddenly, new acting companies could arrive. New goods appeared in shop windows. The narrow-gauge Deadwood Central Railway had already been connecting Deadwood to the mines in lead since 1888, but the Fremont line was the link to the national network, the real end of frontier remoteness. The railroad also brought immigrants from across Europe and Asia, adding to the polyglot character of a town that already included Germans, Irish, Norwegians, English, Chinese, African Americans, and Jewish merchants from Prussia and Bavaria. Deadwood was never as homogeneous as the dime novels made it seem. Now let's go back to that address, Main and Wall Streets. Seth Bullock and Saul Starr's hardware store had survived the fire of 1879. But in March 1894, another fire destroyed the lower business district. This time, the hardware store burned, and Bullock, looking at the ashes, made the most consequential business decision of his career. Instead of rebuilding the store, he decided to build a hotel. Bullock and Starr hauled in native pink and white sandstone from Andrews Quarry in Boulder Canyon. They spent $40,000, roughly equivalent to $1.4 million today, constructing a 3-story, 63-room Italianate hotel that was, by every measure, the finest accommodation between Minneapolis and the Pacific. The lobby had red velvet carpeting, brass chandeliers, oak trim, and a Steinway grand piano. The dining room seated 100 and served pheasant and lobster. Each of the 63 rooms had brass beds and oak dressers. Every floor had a bathroom, a genuine luxury. A library and a parlor opened off the balcony. Steam heat ran through the building. This was 1896, in a town that had been a tent camp 20 years earlier. Bullock had, by this time, become friends with Theodore Roosevelt. They'd met in August 1892, when Roosevelt delivered an impromptu speech at Deadwood City Hall. Their friendship would last a lifetime. Roosevelt would appoint Bullock a U.S. Marshal for South Dakota, and when Roosevelt died in 1919, Bullock and the Society of Black Hills Pioneers erected the first monument in the country dedicated to the late president. The Friendship Tower on what was then Sheep Mountain, renamed Mount Roosevelt. Bullock died of cancer just a few months later, in September 1919, at 70 years old. He was buried on a hilltop in Mount Moriah Cemetery, positioned to face the Friendship Tower. Saul Starr, his partner through all of it, had died 2 years earlier. Starr had served as Deadwood's mayor for 14 years across 10 terms, longer than anyone before or since. The early 1900s were, in many ways, Deadwood's finest hour. In 1903, the Franklin Hotel opened on Upper Main Street, and it made the Bullock look modest. Harris Franklin, born Harris Finkelstein, a Prussian Jewish immigrant who'd arrived in Deadwood with almost nothing and built a fortune through mining, liquor sales, and banking, had offered to match every dollar invested in the project. The final cost was $100,000, more than $3.5 million in today's money. 80 rooms, Greek Revival columns, a lobby fountain, a cigar store, a newsstand, a barber shop, 2 private parlors for ladies, a masseuse, steam heat, an elevator, electric lights, and telephone service in every room. The grand opening on June 4, 1903, drew 250 guests to a banquet. Theodore Roosevelt stayed there. So did William Howard Taft, who dined at the Franklin in October 1911. So did Babe Ruth, who played a barnstorming baseball game at the Deadwood Amusement Park in October 1922. And John Wayne and Buffalo Bill Cody. The Franklin was the kind of hotel that made a town feel like a city. A Carnegie Free Library opened in 1904. The Lawrence County Courthouse was completed in 1907. A new federal courthouse and post office opened in 1908. That same year, strings of colored lights, crimson and gold, 25 bulbs to a string, were hung at intervals across Main Street from Hogarth's shop to the Masonic Temple. The streets were paved with Purington brick. The Homestake slime plant, built in Deadwood to extract gold from a byproduct of crushed ore using a process developed by C.W. Merrill, added another layer to the mining economy. By 1910, the population had climbed to 3,653. Deadwood had newspapers, churches, fraternal lodges, an amusement park, annual celebrations, the Days of '76, which began commemorating the founding era, and a commercial infrastructure that served the entire northern Black Hills. Saul Starr, meanwhile, had become the closest thing Deadwood had to an indispensable citizen. He served on the first town council in 1876, became postmaster in 1877, and was elected mayor in 1884. Over the years, he would serve 10 terms as mayor, spanning 14 years. He was the steady hand to Bullock's imposing presence, the civic engineer to his partner's frontier charisma. When the Spanish-American War ended, Starr petitioned the Bureau of Ordnance and obtained a bronze cannon captured at Cavite in the Philippines, a trophy that arrived in Deadwood on July 6, 1899, and signaled the kind of civic pride you see in towns that think of themselves as permanent. Deadwood had survived not just fires, but floods. In May 1883, a heavy snowmelt followed by torrential rains sent Whitewood and Deadwood creeks surging through town, washing away or badly damaging businesses along Main Street. The town rebuilt again. It always rebuilt. And by December of that same year, the first electric lights were turned on. The pattern was becoming Deadwood's defining trait: catastrophe followed by reconstruction, each time a little more solidly, a little more ambitiously, as if the town were daring the elements to try again. Picture Main Street on a Saturday evening around 1905. The brick-paved road is lit by electric lamps and those strings of crimson and gold bulbs. The Bullock Hotel glows on the corner of Wall Street, its brass chandeliers visible through the windows. Up the hill, the Franklin's white columns catch the light. Between them, 2- and 3-story Victorian commercial blocks line both sides of the street. Hardware stores, grocers, banks, saloons, offices for mining companies, a photography studio run by the prolific John C. H. Grabill. The Deadwood Central narrow gauge chugs between town and the homestake operations in lead. Miners in their work clothes mingle with businessmen in suits. The smell of brick dust and horse manure and cooking grease and cigar smoke. Somewhere, a piano, the sound of a creek running under the street. A town that had been raw mud and dead trees 30 years earlier now looked and felt like it intended to last. But Deadwood's fundamental problem was always geography. The town sat in a gulch. It couldn't sprawl, and its economy depended on a single industry, gold mining, which increasingly meant a single operation. The Homestake, which was located not in Deadwood, but in Lead. Deadwood was the supply town, the entertainment town, the county seat. But it didn't own the mine. The Hearst family did. George Hearst died in Washington in 1891. His widow, Phoebe, who had married him at 19 when he was 41, inherited the fortune and managed the Homestake for 28 years. She was, by all accounts, a remarkable woman. the first to serve on the University of California Board of Regents, and her philanthropy to lead was genuine and substantial: a free public library, a free kindergarten, college scholarships for minors' children, regular donations to churches, and the construction of the Homestake Opera House and Recreation Building, which included a swimming pool, bowling alley, meeting rooms, and a library, all free to the community. But she directed it at Lead, the company town, not at Deadwood. The economic engine was always just down the road, close enough to sustain Deadwood, but never truly Deadwood's own. There was a strange grace period during the Depression. While the rest of the country suffered, gold mining actually became more attractive. The price of gold was fixed, labor was cheap, and the government had an interest in domestic production. The homestake management shortened the work week but raised wages and provided year-end bonuses. Lead and Deadwood weathered the 1930s better than most American communities, a fact that reinforced the dangerous assumption that gold would always be there. The 20th century brought waves that Deadwood rode with diminishing success. W.E. Adams, a pioneer businessman who had established a grocery store on Main Street back in 1877 and served 6 terms as mayor, donated the Adams Memorial Museum to the city in 1930. A gesture that acknowledged what was already becoming clear, that Deadwood's future would be built on memory as much as industry. The museum would become one of the town's most enduring institutions. But the reform movements of the new century were less sentimental. Prohibition arrived in 1919. South Dakota had already passed its own prohibition law back in 1889, though enforcement was sporadic at best. When the federal ban took effect, Deadwood's saloons and gambling halls simply moved behind closed doors. Through the 1920s, drinking, gambling, and prostitution continued to operate with varying degrees of discretion. The federal repeal in 1935 brought gambling back into the open, and it flourished until 1947, when it was officially shut down again. But even then, the backroom games continued. The brothels persisted, too, running more or less openly in the Badlands district well into the 20th century. The last 4 didn't close until May 1980, when federal and state authorities conducted a final raid. The town threw a parade, just as it had when Charlie Utter's wagon train brought the working girls in 1876. The Great Depression hit, and the Franklin Hotel converted to apartments. Mount Rushmore, carved between 1927 and 1941, just 60 miles to the south, brought tourists through the Black Hills, and some of them found their way to Deadwood. The town's population reached its 20th century peak around 1940, with just over 4,000 residents. But the war years drained it. Gold mining was suspended by federal order. The War Production Board needed the men and the machinery elsewhere. The younger men enlisted or went to work in copper mines and airplane factories. The older men who remained made hand grenades and airplane parts in the Homestake foundry. After the war, the slow arithmetic of decline set in. The Homestake modernized and kept producing, but employment fell as machines replaced men. Tourism carried the summer months, but the winters were long and quiet. The 1959 wildfire burned over 4,000 acres and consumed 60 structures, including homes and lumber plants. An evacuation order was issued. The property losses deepened a regional economic downturn that had already been building. In 1961, the Department of the Interior designated the entire town a National Historic Landmark, recognizing what everyone in Deadwood already sensed, that the town's greatest asset was no longer its gold, but its past. The population kept slipping. By 1980, it was 2,035. By 1990, it was 1,830. Buildings on Main Street stood empty or deteriorated. The Bullock Hotel, that $40,000 showpiece with the Steinway and the lobster dinners, had been sold to a family who converted it into a hardware store in 1976. They auctioned off all the original furnishings. The brass beds, the oak dressers, the chandeliers, gone, scattered to whoever bid highest. Imagine Seth Bullock's steel-gray eyes contemplating that particular transaction. Then on December 15, 1987, fire struck again. The Syndicate block on Lee Street, 3 historic buildings, burned to the ground. And this time, the destruction catalyzed something unexpected. A group of local visionaries who called themselves the You Bet Committee had been working for years on an audacious plan: legalize gambling in Deadwood, and use the tax revenue to fund historic preservation. The footage of the syndicate fire became their most powerful argument. They spent 5 years gathering signatures and support, 20,000 volunteer hours. In November 1988, South Dakota voters approved a constitutional amendment allowing limited stakes gaming in Deadwood with 65% of the vote. On November 1st, 1989, an actor dressed as Wild Bill Hickok, accompanied by a woman playing Calamity Jane, fired a revolver into the air and the casinos opened. Deadwood became the third legal gambling destination in the United States, after Nevada and Atlantic City. The initial bet limit was $5. It was raised to $100 in 2000, then to $1,000 in 2012. Roulette, craps, and keno were added in 2015. Through the first 20 years, gamblers wagered over $12.7 billion in Deadwood's casinos. The casinos paid more than $208 million in taxes and fees. The city received over $123 million for local improvements. Real estate prices surged. Kevin Costner, fresh off his Academy Award for Dances with Wolves, bought a casino in the restored Phoenix Block building, the same building that had been named for the mythical bird after the 1879 fire. HBO launched the critically acclaimed series Deadwood in 2004, running 3 seasons and a movie, embedding the town's legends into the national imagination once more. The Bullock Hotel was rescued. New owners purchased the building in the early 1990s and spent years restoring it, stripping paint, restaining woodwork, repapering ceilings in Victorian patterns, hanging 48-inch brass chandeliers chosen from period replicas. The original 63 rooms were consolidated into 28 larger ones. The lobby got a casino floor. It wasn't what Seth Bullock built exactly, but it was closer than a hardware store. The Franklin Hotel underwent its own restoration and reopened as the Silverado Franklin, with 81 rooms, a steakhouse, a buffet, and a gaming floor where the lobby fountain used to be. What gambling saved was the architecture. What it changed was the character. Walk down Main Street today, and the brick facades are immaculate, the Victorian details preserved with the kind of care that only dedicated tax revenue can buy. But behind most of those facades, on the ground floors, are slot machines. The sound of Deadwood in the 21st century is not the clang of stamp mills, or the shouts of miners, or the strains of a Langrichet Company performance. It's the electronic chirp of video poker. Kevin Costner's Midnight Star, housed in that beautifully named Phoenix Block, served buffalo fillet and displayed movie memorabilia for over 2 decades before it closed in 2017. Another victim of the spreading competition that came as state after state legalized its own casinos. The advantage that made Deadwood special in 1989, when it was one of only 3 legal gambling destinations in the country, eroded steadily as the market expanded. The neighboring states that once sent their gamblers to Deadwood now kept them home. The Homestake Mine, the engine that built the whole region, ceased production at the end of 2001. Low gold prices, poor ore quality, high costs. After 126 years of continuous operation, the longest-running mine in American history went quiet. Barrick Gold, which had merged with Homestake Mining Company, kept pumping water out of the shafts while the scientific community lobbied for a new use. In 2007, the National Science Foundation selected the old mine as the site for the Deep Underground Science and Engineering Laboratory, where physicists now search for dark matter and study neutrinos nearly a mile below the surface. The mine that George Hearst bought for $70,000, that produced 40 million ounces of gold, now hunts for the origins of the universe. There's something in that. The 2020 census counted 1,156 people in Deadwood. The median age was 56. Nearly a third of residents were 65 or older. The most common employment sectors were arts and entertainment, accommodation and food services, and retail, the infrastructure of a tourist economy. The town draws around 2 million visitors a year. They come for the casinos, for the reenactments of the Hickok shooting that have been performed every summer since 1924, for Mount Moriah Cemetery where Hickok and Calamity Jane are buried side by side, for the Adams Museum, for the Days of '76 rodeo. They walk down Main Street, past the Bullock and the Franklin, and the spot where the Gem used to stand, and the 600 feet of pavement that was once the largest Chinatown east of San Francisco, and they take photographs of a town that looks, in its bones, almost exactly like it did in 1880, when the people who refused to leave rebuilt it in brick and stone, determined to make something permanent out of a place that had every reason to disappear. At 566 Main Street, where Wing Sue once sold silk and porcelain and tea from behind the counter of his emporium, there is a bronze statue. On Christmas Eve, 2005, part of the original Wing Sue building collapsed. The brick walls that had stood since 1885 finally gave way, over a century after the man who built them left for China and never managed to return. The bricks are still there, some of them. Deadwood is still there. The creek still runs beneath the street.